Hello, BookTube. Welcome to Northamptonshire County Records Office, or at least the car park of. The building is behind me. And welcome to a vlog for Middlemarch March. So I took the day off today, mainly because it was sunny, and I was thinking, spring is finally here. This last winter has just been not unusually cold, but unusually gloomy, unusually cloudy, and we haven't seen a lot of the sun. So the sun is out today, and there's something about that. You almost feel compelled to go outside and do something. And okay, I'm not entirely outside, but I will be. I just am taking advantage of this quiet place where I can film. This car park isn't very busy, and I don't think I will find many people walking around. So I thought, yeah, we've got notes ready. Let's do it. So today we're going to be vlogging about the introduction and the first 4 chapters of George Eliot, A Life by Rosemary Ashton. So the same person who is editing the Penguin Classics version, the paperback of Middlemarch, that I'm using for all the meditations. So I've been on the lookout for this book, thought I would have to buy it new, was very pleased to find it secondhand at Scoob Books and paid about £9 for the hardback, which I didn't think was too bad because it's in pretty good condition. Let's talk about the book though, because you still can buy hardcover copies. So what do you get? You get 382 pages of the text itself. I will talk about some of the things that come at the end of the book, probably in a later vlog when it will seem more appropriate. But we've got 382 pages. Let's show you a page of the text in full, because you'll see it's reasonably dense on the page. It's 11-point font, and although you can see there's space breaks between paragraphs and subsections, after that the text is single-spaced, and any quotations are slightly smaller. They're 10-point font. So you do get your money's worth with that. It is a thematic biography, which means although, yes, it does proceed pretty much in chronological order, the chapters, and we won't get to these chapters today, but the chapters where she begins to write fiction, Ashton organizes her writing around each novel. But we won't see that yet. The George Eliot that we're looking at isn't really George Eliot. What we are looking at, the first 4 chapters, we're looking at Mary Ann Evans as she was, as her legal name was, as she grew up, as she reached as she got up to the age of 31, 32, when she'd met George Henry Lewes, and then I think began to find her way towards a career writing fiction. We'll start with the introduction. If you already know a fair bit about George Eliot, the person, if you have an idea of her biography already from other sources, I don't think you'll find the introduction will contain a great deal of new information. Ashton is speaking there to people who are completely new to this person. So she's emphasizing the Eliot's character and how we're going to find not only do we have this remarkable intellect, which she was, but we're going to find it in combination with some very other interesting personality characteristics. She talks about how Eliot could be so staunch and strict and judgmental on the one hand, and yet on the other, she was also fantastic for overthrowing ideas, discarding traditional ideas when she could see that they didn't make any sense. And at the same time, she was also very traditional in the way that she had affection for and attachment to the idea of family, an idea that she didn't really get to realize in the first 31, 32 years of her life. She had difficulty with that. And it seems to me that if you could give a theme to the first 4 chapters of the book, it would be Eliot searching for her place where she could settle down. Maps are good. Maps are good because you just need to get your bearings sometimes. So this map that you're seeing right now is backing up to show you the whole of England, a little bit of Scotland and Ireland and Wales thrown in. But you'll see the red marker there, which is pointing to the area where George Eliot grew up. There's another tinier red dot on there. That's where I am, roughly. more or less. So you can see that I'm quite close. There are some sites in and around the West Midlands where Eliot grew up that I should visit, and maybe I could give you a bit more of a flavour of things there. But suffice it for now that this is where we are. If I zoom in, the second map is zooming in so that you can see the towns of Nuneaton and the city of Coventry. She grew up between those two. She was born in Nuneaton and baptized there. We have a record of that baptism. We'll show you that as well. In fact, I am indebted for this opening episode of the vlog to the person who watches television, who is, if I haven't said it before, a genealogist, a family historian. And the reason we're here at the Northamptonshire Archives today is because the person who watches television visits there every Tuesday to do personal work, helping the archive to digitize some of their records that are currently only on paper. And so I think it's appropriate that we are here to talk about these early records. So you can see here, this is the baptism certificate of Mary Ann Evans, showing her father's name, Robert Evans, her mother, Christiana. And you can see it's dated the 29th of November, which we understand that George Eliot's actual birth date was the 22nd. And we get this not because there's any birth certificate. Birth certificates were not required record keeping in the 1810s and 1820s. It was 1832 when recordings of births became mandatory in the United Kingdom. But the record of baptisms is mandatory. Mary Ann Evans lets everyone know in her personal correspondence that she considered the 22nd of November 1819 to be her birth date. Mary Ann started school very young. She was actually sent to school in the daytime before she was 5 years old, along with her brother Isaac. And when she was 5, she and her older sister Chrissy were sent to a boarding school, too far away for them to return home except for the holidays. Although, as it happened, the particular school was located within walking distance of one of Mary Ann's maternal aunts. So you sense that it was chosen because it was close to a relative. But it is odd. It was not unusual for young boys to be sent away to boarding school at a young age, but it wasn't usual for girls. Girls normally stayed at home and had some kind of education in the home, whatever the parents decided. And although Ashton hints that perhaps Mrs. Evans, Christiana, had genteel aspirations for her daughters, and that maybe is why she sent them away to the school, it still seems young to send a 5-year-old girl away. That seems a little strange. And so I have my own theory as to why Mary Ann was separated from her family so young. And that's because there isn't much in the written record, not in correspondence and not in any local documents, about Mary Ann Evans' mother. You see her there on the baptismal certificate. There's really nothing else about her during Mary's growing up. And so when we do finally see some record of her, it's Robert Evans writing to his employer in 1835, and he's confiding that his wife is ill with breast cancer, and that, I think he puts it, that she doesn't have much more comfort left, indicating that he thinks she's very close to death. This means that she may well have been ill for a few years before that time, and possibly even before then. Mary Ann Evans, as it happens, was the youngest of Christiana's children, but she wasn't the last born. Younger than Mary Ann, there were twin boys who were born in March 1821, but unfortunately they only lived a few days, and they are buried with Robert Evans and his wife Christiana in the family tomb, which is in Nuneaton. So Mary Ann was the youngest, and it seems to me that perhaps the reason that she was sent away to school along with her sister and her brother was that if she was left at home, with Robert Evans' job probably taking him away from home a great deal, there probably was no one to look after little Mary Ann. And if her mother was less than perfectly well, then it may have been seen as a pragmatic thing to send her away with her sister close to her aunt so that she had some kind of family connection, but was no burden to her mother by remaining in the house. Marianne continued in boarding school through her teens. She went to a different school then, one based in Coventry, and it was run by a family who were Baptist. And here is where I believe the more traditional Christianity, the Church of England Christianity of her parents, was maybe replaced or overwhelmed by the more enthusiastic version of Christianity practiced by the family who ran this school. And it just seems that that stringent flavor starts to appear in what writings Marianne was doing in her teens, which are mostly school assignments. And what I'm going to quote you now is a piece of poetry that she wrote. This is from page 22 of the book, and it's titled, On Being Called a Saint. A saint! Oh, would that I could claim the privileged, the honored name, and confidently take my stand, though lowest in the saintly band. Would, though it were in scorn applied, that term the test of truth could bide, like kingly salutation given, in mockery to the King of Heaven. I won't read much more. I don't find it. I'm the world's worst judge of poetry, but even I am starting to cringe a little bit at it. But I read it because it struck me so much as like the prologue in Middlemarch, referring to Saint Teresa of Avila and the possibility of a young woman wanting some kind of great calling like Saint Teresa. It just seemed to me that echoed in that poem was the same strong desire. That's what I want to be. I want to be a saint. I don't want to settle. Well, she does say she'd settle for being the lowest of the saints. I think that's fine. That's still pretty high ranking. You still need a great calling. So you could see perhaps a consciousness or a desire in Marianne for something great, intellectually, philosophically, spiritually, all three, all wrapped up in that, well, slightly cringy little adolescent poem. In chapter 2, we get the sense of another relocation and dislocation for Mary Ann Evans. Her life, it seems, to be full of a lot of these. The family home, Griff House. Let me show you a photograph of it. It was within a few miles of Coventry. And you can see this is the house, Kirka 1908. So you can see it's a beautiful big building, definitely would accommodate a family of 5, which is how many children Robert and Christiana had in total. And this is the same property now, just for a contrast. It is now a hotel and restaurant. So you can actually stay at George Eliot's childhood home, should you want to. And if you compare, I'm just going to try to show you here, the old house structure. Do you see the bay window and the little window above it from the 1908 photo? If I now compare that, if I now put the Beefeater photo back and you look to the left-hand side of the property, you can see the same bay window with the smaller window above it. That gives you, so you can see that the building has been added to, and there are other buildings on the site in various states of repair from what I understand. And I do feel like I must go stay there sometime just to report on the state of the property for literary purposes, of course. What records we have of Marianne's stay at Griff House, and she would have only been there mainly for when she was very small and then for school holidays, but she recalls it glowingly. She would have been in the countryside. There were extensive grounds at Griff House. There were stables. There was a dairy. There were other outbuildings. There was farmyard space, and Coventry Canal was close by. So you can maybe start to see the setting that she could have used easily for the mill on the Floss, for the house near the canal. And I think the sad thing is that she didn't really get to keep that home. It was obviously meant something to her, created some kind of stability for her. But when her mother died, when she was 16, and shortly after that, her older brother Isaac married in 1841. And her father, Robert Evans, took the decision that he and Marianne would move into Coventry, and obviously she would look after him, as any unmarried younger daughter should. And the Griff House would be given to Isaac and his new wife because they would most likely start a family. The property that Robert Evans and Mary Ann moved into is still standing in Coventry. The road it's on has been renamed George Eliot Road. The property isn't in very great condition right now. I don't know if anything is being done to preserve it, and I'm not sure whether Mary Ann would have cared greatly. She wasn't happy in that house. I think that's the most honest thing that can be said, and Rosemary Ashton makes that clear. The only happiness she did get was when she met, via her next-door neighbour, Charles and Cara Bray, who lived about a mile closer into Coventry in a property called Rose Hill. Once George Eliot was able to enter and visit Rose Hill often and spend time with the Brays, that's where she began to feel comfortable and more at home, if you like, because it was the Brays who I think probably gave her access to the kind of books that fed her new rationality and skepticism toward religion. They probably let her read her first copy of Charles Hennell's book, published in 1838, titled Inquiry Concerning the Origin of Christianity. And a few months after having read that, Mary Ann Evans announced to her father in January 1842 that she was not going to attend church with him anymore. And this was an astounding scandal in the Midlands amongst the middle classes at that time. That was a horrible... It was a shocking thing to do. It was an absolutely shocking thing to do, and it caused problems both with her father and with her brother Isaac. I think it set up their distrust of her fundamentally that never really left. Mary Ann agreed to a compromise while her father was alive. He said she could have whatever belief she wanted, but would she please every Sunday come and sit in a pew in the Holy Trinity Church to keep up appearances. And chapter 2 makes it clear that Mary Ann continued to study books which were skeptical of Christian belief. She spent 2 years translating a work by Strauss titled Das Leben Jesu. It was a book similar to Hennell's, and it demonstrates the breadth and depth of Mary Ann Evans' knowledge that the translation, when it was published, now her name was not published on it, she was the translator, but her name was never printed anywhere. But the book was critically acclaimed, and everyone recognized the scholarship of that anonymous translator. Chapter 3 deals with the final years of the life of Robert Evans. He died on the 30th of May, 1849. That left Mary Ann, age 29, still single, though she had had a couple of interesting encounters with men and one proposal of marriage, which she had turned down. On the 12th of June, she left England and she accompanied Charles and Cara Bray on a tour of Europe, which took her to France and Italy and finally Switzerland. Now, the Brays wanted to return home on the 26th of July. But Mary Ann Evans was not ready, and so Charles Bray looked out and found her a room that she could rent in a family home, and she stayed in Geneva, Switzerland, until March of 1850. And then when she travelled back to Coventry and tried to stay for a while, both with her brother Isaac and her older married sister Chrissy, she could tell that she felt like an outcast, and she wrote in her correspondence of how her dismal relatives were they were nothing like her, and she just could not consider living with them for the rest of her life. And so she made plans, again using Charles and Cara Bray and the people that they knew in London, to go down and stay on the Strand, in a room in a house owned by a couple, the Chapmans. John Chapman, the husband, was seeking to start a publication. He was a bookseller, but he was also trying to make his name as a publisher of a new journal called the Westminster Review. Chapter 4 looks at these few years that she spent living on the Strand in John Chapman's house, and it didn't start out very well. I think the thing that struck me about this period of time, obviously Ashton talks about how Marion, because she changed her name from the two names Mary Ann to Marion, Marion Evans. It's almost a reinvention of herself, her new London self. And yet her new London self got off to a rocky start. And I think that's because, along with her need for intellectual and spiritual feeding. She constantly needed to be reading and writing and taking in new ideas. At the same time, she also seemed to have a strong emotional need for some kind of belonging. And that seemed to manifest itself in, she fell in love extraordinarily easily and not always, I think, wisely. First of all, John Chapman, the head of household in this place where she was renting. He already had a wife and a mistress who was also his governess for his children. And this seems to be an understanding, because the wife and governess did seem to know the roles that each other was playing. The problem was, when Marian Evans arrived on the scene, John Chapman became very close to her very quickly and was caught sometimes in what seemed to be very compromising closeness with Marian. It's not clear entirely whether or not they were sexually intimate, although Chapman did keep diaries with codes to indicate when he had sex with his wife and his mistress, and there are some hints that perhaps they were that close. At any rate, it did not please the wife and mistress, who I think felt that that's enough women in your life, thank you. And they actually closed ranks, confronted John, and made him come to an agreement to send Marian away. So she not long arrived at the Strand, and she had to go back to Coventry. She stayed with Charles and Cara Bray for a while, and in the National Census in March 1851, you will find Mary Ann Evans, and I now show you the entry, which is a little tricky to read, but she is down there as a visitor, and she had to stay there until the September of the same year, until she could return and negotiate a return with Mrs. Chapman, and then resume her stay. And it's at that point that she became the anonymous editor of the Westminster Review. And to be fair, she did an awful lot of the legwork by correspondence, trying to persuade the different contributors of money and of writing to continue doing so, because the journal was in a lot of financial trouble in its early life. But her personal involvements with other men. In 30th of March, 1852, there are hints in her personal correspondence of an involvement with a sub-editor of The Economist, Herbert Spencer. And that affair, and I call it that, it's not documented again how intimate the two of them became, but they did go out together in public frequently. It seemed to have become very serious very quickly, and then had to break off in the August, and it upset Marian very much. I don't think she wanted it to end, and I'm quoting here a letter that she wrote in the July to Spencer to try to establish a long-lasting, serious relationship with him. And what you might see here, as I read from page 99, are hints a little bit of Fred Vincy. Just listen. I want to know if you can assure me that you will not forsake me, and that you will always be with me as much as you can and share your thoughts and feelings with me. If you become attached to someone else, then I must die. But until then, I could gather courage to work and make life valuable if only I had you near me. I do not ask you to sacrifice anything. I would be very good and cheerful and never annoy you, but I find it impossible to contemplate life under any other conditions. Unfortunately, Spencer maintained the same attitude to her from the beginning of the relationship, such as it was, until it ended. He said that he loved her as a person, but was not in love with her and did not want anything permanent, did not want to marry himself. George Henry Lewes was a friend of Herbert Spencer's, and now and again, and perhaps for protection, a bit of a chaperone to ward off Marian's enthusiasm that the relationship go further, Spencer would sometimes invite Lewes to come with him to the theatre or other events that he'd invited Marian to. And at first she doesn't really notice him, and then her feelings seem to change over time. 18th of September, 1852, she's already remarking to someone that Lewes had called on her by himself. And she mentions that he visited her again on her birthday, 22nd of November, and spent 2 hours talking. By January 1853, she was talking to a friend about seeking a new place to live, somewhere else away from the Strand, and perhaps away from eyes that would see things that she didn't want them to see. And this may have been a move to get that privacy. And there are also phrases in George Henry Lewes' letters to his friends, which could be interpreted, if you understand the literary allegories, as hints that he had a lover, which was very likely Marian Evans. And that's where we leave the book now, at the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, as she begins this relationship with George Henry Lewes. One thing I didn't realize was that before Lewes met Marian Evans, the arrangement with his wife was already an interesting one. His wife already had a relationship with another man, which Lewes was aware of and totally in agreement with, and he allowed his wife bore children by this other man, but they were raised in the Lewes household as if they were George Henry Lewes' children, but they were not biologically. So effectively, this open marriage was started by Mrs. George Henry Lewes, the real Mrs. George Henry Lewes. George himself didn't follow on with a permanent version of his own relationship until he met Marian Evans. And then he established his own place. He got a flat from a friend of his, and then from there on, he and George Eliot spent more and more time together. So the open arrangement was already there with his wife. I think I had assumed, and maybe some people, if you don't know, might think, wow, what did the real Mrs. George Henry Lewes think of Marian Evans coming on the scene? And the truth is, it probably was helpful to her because her husband had been unhappy because he didn't seem to have a partner in life. He had a wife, but she had a partner and he didn't really have someone. So I think it probably worked out for the best as far as the Lewes family were concerned. Not so much with us, but we'll deal with that later. I think it's interesting just how much George Eliot needed or seemed to need emotionally this relationship. It seemed to me that the story of her life up until her early 30s is one of never being able to settle down, never being able to belong, never having any ties or anything that bound her to someone. And although she wasn't able to marry George Henry Lewes, to her, I think the strength of an emotional binding was enough. That's all she wanted, and all she seemed to be looking for. That seemed almost to be a prerequisite for her ability to work. And it's interesting that Ashton says somewhat the same in the introduction, that maybe Marian needed that emotional stability first before she could really embark on her career as a writer, just because of what she'd experienced growing up. And that's today's vlog done. Thanks very much for checking in, guys. I've got to go now because this funny light is shining in my glasses as the sun moves around in the sky, and we're going to have lunch soon anyway, and then I have a few errands to run this afternoon. Look out this Sunday for another meditation, which will be starting chapter 15, and we'll be learning a bit about Lidget's backstory. I find that fascinating. So look forward to seeing you then, everyone. In the meantime, happy reading. If the sunshine doesn't distract you, if you're living in the UK, take the book outside. No, it's too cold. Don't take the book outside. Do what you got to do, okay? And I'll see you on Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.